Azerbaijan is preparing for war while Russia makes key gains in its invasion of Ukraine. We also touch on a story on corporate militias being developed in China and how they can be a reflection on what exactly Xi Jinping is projecting are threats for China's future. These stories and more in this week's International Affairs News Roundup. On to the first story. Azerbaijan is preparing for war. Again, last week, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan accused Azerbaijan of preparing for a full-scale war against Armenia. Pashinyan suggested that Azerbaijan might be planning to attack Armenian territory after fully annexing Nagorno-Karabakh last year, and he described his assessment as being grounded in Azerbaijan's intentions and activities. However, despite these claims, Azerbaijan's foreign ministry has described these claims as groundless. Now, this is not really a conflict that has gotten the media attention that it really probably deserves. In 2022, we saw a conflict between the two over Nagorno-Karabakh, and that's really where we got familiarized with the platform of the TV2, as well as seeing in real time what happens to armored columns that attack fortified positions without any kind of air support or combined arms support. After seizing parts of Armenian territory as well as Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan and Armenia reached a brief ceasefire agreement with Russia acting as the ceasefire moderator. However, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they ultimately had to strip the peacekeeping force to simply get more soldiers into the fight, and so that really left Azerbaijan with not a lot of blocks ahead of them to finish what they had started in Nagorno-Karabakh. Since then, Armenia has been very concerned with Azerbaijan finishing what they started by attacking the Zanskar corridor and linking Azerbaijan proper with its province of Nakhchivan. Now, the Zanskar corridor is an extension of Armenia that gives it a land border with Iran, but also separates Nakhchivan with Azerbaijan proper, and that's clearly something that Azerbaijan doesn't really enjoy. What exactly does this conflict have to do with anything that we've talked about recently? Well, you're in luck, because as is true with just about anything in international relations, everything's interconnected. Of course, we've already discussed the impact of the war in Ukraine on the Russian peacekeeping forces. However, not only does this conflict potentially impact the war in Ukraine, it also potentially impacts the conflict in the Middle East, specifically Iran. Iran has supported Armenia, and this has actually frustrated its largely Azeri minority, which actually makes up about a third of its 88 million person population. However, Iran is very much not in favor of the Zanskar corridor being closed to them. This would in effect prevent Iran from having extensive influence in the Caucasus. And if this all wasn't complicated enough, Azerbaijan is backed by Turkey. In fact, Turkey views a linkage between Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan proper as opening the door for Central and East Asia. Not only is Turkey a huge backer of Azerbaijan, but so is Israel. All of this effectively pins Iran at odds with Azerbaijan and Turkey over an area that has been historically actively militarily contested. Okay, so is this going to be the next war or what? Well, maybe, but I wouldn't necessarily go there just yet. Turkey has offered to talk things over with Iran, specifically discussing what will happen with the Zanskar corridor. Frankly, neither side wants a war in the Middle East, and with Iran currently dealing with multiple other crises, now cannot be a worse time for this situation to develop into an active conflict. That said, the crisis in the Middle East does pose opportunities for Azerbaijan to take matters into their own hands and to take the corridor by force. Since one of the primary deterrents, being Iran, as well as the peacekeeping force being Russia, are both dealing with other issues right now. And really nobody can come to the help of Armenia. So we'll have to wait and see what happens, but my personal assessment is that, hey, we're just going to monitor the situation and we'll see what happens. Next, Alexei Navalny has died. After spending the last few months in a Russian prison, Russian authorities have announced that Alexei Navalny has died. And shocker, this follows a visit by the FSB to the prison colony where Navalny was staying, where they took out cameras and microphones and other kinds of technology that monitored the prison. Now really, this news isn't that big of a surprise, it was really just a matter of time. Navalny's actions have made him a thorn in the side of the Kremlin, leading a series of legal battles, detentions, and harassment all aimed at silencing Navalny. In August of 2020, Navalny was poisoned with a nerve agent, which he and many international observers attributed to Vladimir Putin. He was medically evacuated to Germany where he received treatment. However, once he was able, he returned back to Moscow and promptly arrested. His wife, Yulia Navalnaya, has announced that she will continue the fight that Alexei had started. However, shortly after announcing this on Twitter, her account was suspended. Now, as of right now, her account is back up, but no announcement has been given as to why her account was suspended. It's just, in general, a weird deal. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding about who exactly Navalny was, because yes, he was a key opponent to Putin. However, it's not like he was going to turn Russia around and turn it to democracy. While he was somebody that was a thorn in Putin's side and somebody who exposed exposed corruption in the Russian government, he was also a Russian nationalist. In fact, throughout his political career, he espoused xenophobic beliefs about Russian nationalism and anti-immigration. He also supported the Russian annexation of parts of Ukraine and Belarus, and he also had strong beliefs over Georgia that have led to a lot of folks in Georgia not really liking him that much. So while we can all agree that Alexei Navalny was a very important figure in the Russian political landscape, he really was not that much better than Putin in terms of politics and policy. And we should definitely remember the corruption that he exposed in the Russian government and what that meant. However, we shouldn't really regale him as what I've seen others kind of describe him as being the Nelson Mandela of Russia. Needless to say, Nelson Mandela was not xenophobic. Now, the news about Alexei Navalny follows even more significant news out of Ukraine. Ukraine has officially withdrawn from the city of Avdiivka, and this follows months and months of fighting with thousands and thousands of soldiers on both sides losing their lives in the fighting. And while I'm not really holding my breath for accurate accounting on either side, this certainly appears to be one of the bloodiest battles of this war so far. In fact, according to British intelligence, Russia lost around 30,000 soldiers killed or wounded, as well as over 400 tanks. All told, that's more losses than what Russia lost in its entire invasion of Afghanistan over a 10-year period. A war, mind you, that heavily impacted the Soviet Union economically, politically, and socially, and is often cited as one of the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed altogether. Well, they just absorbed those costs in the matter of months over one city with a population of roughly 30,000. According to Ukraine, the numbers are even more intense for Russia, with over 47,000 troops killed or wounded, and over 1,100 tanks and IFVs destroyed. And that also includes nearly 250 artillery systems and 5 planes. Since the fall of Avdiivka, Russia has lost even more fighter jets as well, some deep in Russian-held territory. Some OSINT analysts have followed the math and have estimated a roughly 13-to-1 equipment loss ratio in Ukraine's favor, meaning for every tank or IFV that Ukraine lost, Russia lost 13. And I mean, this is largely going off of numbers that Ukraine is reporting, so let's check what Russia is saying about Avdiivka. Well, it's really not that much better. One Russian reporter was stating that at least 16,000 Russian soldiers were irreplaceable losses, meaning that they were either killed or significantly wounded and will not be returning to the formation at a later time. This reporter also stated that 300 tanks and IFVs were lost as well. With Ukraine likely overstating the casualty rate and Russia likely downplaying the casualty rate, the number is probably somewhere in the middle, but in either case, that's still much higher than the losses that the Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan, which if we're going to use that as a comparison, then that is significant. It should also be noted that one of the Russian reporters that was citing the numbers of Russian losses around Avdiivka committed suicide days later. In the Battle of Avdiivka and the end of the Battle of Avdiivka have kind of showed the diverging paths between the tone between the pro-Ukrainian side online and the pro-Russian side online. A lot of pro-Ukrainian sources are increasingly frustrated with the congressional deadlock, which has held back further Ukrainian aid, and this has led to a significant amount of shell hugger amongst Ukrainian troops. The pro-Russian side is talking a lot about the losses in Avdiivka and how much further they'll have to continue fighting. Battles like Avdiivka, like Severodonetsk, like Bakhmut, and like Lysychansk, like these are all perfect opportunities for Ukraine to bleed the Russian offensive dry. And I'm saying this pretty callously. I recognize that at the ground level, there's a lot of soldiers that are human beings that, Preston Stewart kind of made a comment that these are still, sons, fathers, husbands that may not have really wanted to be there in the first place. In fact, a lot of these soldiers were pressed into service despite their wishes, and they're really stuck basically in human wave attacks. However, at the same time, it's a war, and for Ukraine to win, they're going to have to bleed the Russian attack dry. The same statement that I just made about Russian soldiers can also be made about Ukrainian soldiers. In fact, none of these soldiers would be fighting it out on the battlefield right now if Russia didn't invade or if Russia just chose to go back home. But because they're still there, we've got to talk about what needs to be done for Ukraine to win. Obviously, Russia still has a manpower and equipment advantage. And with Western aid to Ukraine hitting the rocks right now, this difference is going to become even more pronounced. However, you would think that Russia was trying to correct this advantage by wasting a lot of resources and human lives over small towns like Avdiivka. And while Avdiivka does hold some level of strategic and tactical value, you do have to wonder about whether or not the juice was worth the squeeze, especially if you're having to extend out these losses across multiple battles like Bakhmut and like some of the other ones that they fought, and like some of the battles that they'll likely have to fight here in the near future if they want to continue their advance. In each of these cases, Russia decided to attack using basically human wave attacks, where according to one veteran that was there at Avdiivka describing Russian tactics, the Russians would send a group of 10 to 20 soldiers forward into Ukrainian fire, and with half of that group or even more being killed off, the remainder of the group would seek places to hide and wait for the next wave. And ultimately, the survivors of each wave would be able to form up a group strong enough to continue the attack forward. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty terrible and just downright insane, especially considering that these aren't zombies. These are actual real people. And while Avdiivka had some value, it also had value for Ukraine in holding it and using it to bleed the Russian attack dry. And it served its value. Now that Avdiivka has fallen, Ukraine can transition to its next set of defensive positions and basically restart the whole process all over again. And even despite all of this, you have Russian leadership like Sergei Shoigu basically stating that Avdiivka was taken with minimal losses and that the attack on Avdiivka will be taught in military academies in the future. And I mean, what? I mean, sure, teach these guys how to attack using human wave attacks. As an American, and if there's, ultimately going to be a war between, NATO and Russia sometime in the future, and hopefully not, that would be very bad. But if that's how they view war as being fought, then, I guess, go for it. But from a human perspective, dude, what? There's also some concern that the Russians will launch attacks further north in Luhansk, as well as down south in Zaporizhia. North in Luhansk, you have the reconstituted remains of the 1st Guard Tanks Army, and then down in the south you have what remains of the Ukrainian salient from its counteroffensive over the last summer. So Russia will likely make an attempt to take out that salient and retake the Robotyne. And if Sergei Shoigu views battles like Bakhmut and Avdiivka as triumphant victories that should be repeated, then I would hate to be a Russian soldier right now on any part of the front line, especially one with the 1st Guard Tanks Army, one down in Zaporizhia. Now, one of the big advantages for Ukraine holding Donetsk city and for having long-range fires is that it allows Ukraine to disrupt Russia's massing of forces for an attack. And platforms like HIMARS and Storm Shadow have made it very easy for Ukraine to identify those formations and target them very quickly. While that's going to be even more challenging for Russia if Congress is ultimately able to pass a funding bill for Ukraine. President Biden is reportedly planning on sending longer-range ATACMS to Ukraine, which would not only allow Ukraine to target Russian forces deep into Russian-held territory, it would allow Ukraine to target Russian forces from beyond Crimea. Now, this is significant. You might remember in previous videos I've discussed how ATACMS was not really something that Biden wanted to send to Ukraine out of risk of escalating the conflict. Simply put, he didn't want the US to be sending Ukraine weapons that Ukraine would use to target the Russian mainland, because Russia might see that as basically the United States getting involved in the war in a more serious and material way. With the rest of US aid to Ukraine also scaling up and Russia not really doing much about it, it looks like long-range ATACMS are next on the list. And this is very important. Right now, for Ukraine to target deep into Russian-held territory with HIMARS, they've got to get HIMARS pretty close to the front line. With longer-range munitions, they'll be able to fire on Russian positions in Crimea and other parts of Russian-held Ukraine from anywhere else in Ukraine pretty much, from very deep in Ukrainian-held territory, which grants them much greater survivability. This basically opens up Pandora's box for what you can do with HIMARS. Now, it's not all good news for Ukraine though, because Russia is set to receive over 400 ballistic missiles from Iran. Russia has had to increasingly rely on its allies for material support, especially for munitions. You might remember that North Korea is sending Iran artillery ammunition, and Iran has also supported Russia with ballistic missiles and drones. Now, this is all one area where things could potentially get better for Ukraine. However, there is an issue on the Ukrainian border that we need to talk about. Polish farmers are protesting along the border of Ukraine. It's causing some logistical issues between Poland and Ukraine. Sparked by grievances over cheap Ukrainian grain basically saturating the European and the Polish market since the war started, which undercuts the local prices and the livelihoods of Polish farmers. These Polish farmers have all taken to blocking roads and border crossings. In fact, they've also begun dumping Ukrainian grain on the street. This situation has led to an increase in tensions between what has otherwise been a cooperative relationship between Poland and Ukraine. However, I think it's important to discuss the context on why these farmers are protesting, because it's not just in Poland that they're protesting. In fact, the European Union, aiming to support Ukraine in its defense against Russia, it has mandated for tariff-free imports of Ukrainian grain to EU markets. And this isn't the only decision that the EU has made agriculturally truly, they have also implemented other kinds of policies targeting emissions and to reduce climate change. And this has all negatively impacted farmers all across Europe. So the Polish farmers aren't necessarily just protesting Ukraine. They're also protesting other kinds of policies done by the European Union. In fact, we've seen farmers pull out everything from old tanks to creating tractor blockades to French farmers blasting manure and fertilizer on government buildings. And I mean, dude, listen, however bad protests get here in America, they're never going to get to the French level. Let's be real. I had the chance to go see one for myself, and it was just a run-in-the-mill afternoon. Like, I don't even think it was necessarily like a big protest. And they were like shooting fireworks at the cops, and it was just kind of like, dog, like, it's Tuesday. What are we doing? But blasting manure into a government building is like next level. I just wanted to pause and acknowledge what the French are doing with their protesting tactics, because they are truly built different. Now, with all of this going on, tomorrow, February 24th, actually marks the 2-year anniversary of Russia's renewed invasion of Ukraine. However, those of you that have been paying attention to this conflict for much longer realize that February 20th marked the 10-year anniversary for when this whole conflict began. And back in 2014, you'll remember the Maidan Revolution, and then you'll remember the Russian attempt to annex Crimea and other parts of the Donbass. And that's really what kicked off this conflict from the very beginning. Now, in the years between 2014 and 2022, around 14,000 Ukrainian troops had been killed in the fighting, with hundreds of thousands of civilians being displaced. However, since Russia kicked off its second invasion, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Over 300,000 Russian soldiers are estimated to have been killed, with over 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers being estimated to have been killed, with millions of Ukrainian civilians being displaced. And around all of that, European security has been upended. This war has gone much longer than anybody, certainly myself included, really expected it to go. And as you can tell from what we've already talked about in this video and in past videos, it's likely to go on for much longer. Neither side really has shown any signs of wanting to stop. And so we've talked a lot about Russia and Ukraine, but it's time that we talk about China, because they are forming corporate militias. Now imagine you log into work one day and you've got your team sync at say 8:30 or whatever. And you got a 9 o'clock after that 8:30 team sync where you're going to discuss military recruitment. And the thing is, you don't work for the Ministry of Defense or the Army. You work as like an accountant at like a dairy company. Well, that's what's going on in China. Since 2017, under Xi Jinping's leadership, China has actually been dusting out something from the old Mao playbook and is recreating corporate militias. Basically, in this situation, employees that work for different kinds of industries, especially ones that would be needed in wartime to increase production, these employees would be co-opted to also help out with things like recruitment and training. This is all part of an effort to boost the civil-military fusion in China, and it aims to leverage advanced technologies, logistics, and infrastructure in the civilian sector for military use. Companies, particularly those in key industries like technology and manufacturing, they're all encouraged to participate in national defense, though often that's going to be through the support of militia units like what we're talking about. Members of these militias will often meet to discuss things like I've said, like training and recruitment, as well as some other things. And like I said before, this is not a new concept. This is actually part of the old Mao playbook, and this was part of the idea of the popular war, the people's war. And this helped ensure military readiness, but also industrial preparedness for a large-scale conflict. Not only that, but it helped the state maintain stricter control over national industries and the people that worked there. Now, at first, whenever I saw this, I thought that this was crazy. However, digging even further into this, I think it actually makes complete sense as to why Xi Jinping is dusting this out right now. We've discussed before the Chinese economy and how they are facing some serious problems right now. In fact, their economy is actually beginning to slow down to some of the lowest levels of growth that we've seen so far in the past 2 decades. It's even declining in some areas. Central element of China's social contract is that there will be fewer individual liberties, but in exchange there will be rising prosperity and more opportunities for the individual. Well, ever since COVID, and even to a degree before COVID, China's economy began to slow down, with debt-fueled real estate investments really kind of taking the economy and creating an economic bubble within the real estate market. This is also impacted by a rising middle class that wants a higher standard of living and is less tolerant of losing civil liberties, as well as an increasingly expensive military that's going to be harder to maintain. There have also been larger costs to China as a result of its tensions with the United States and the West, with a lot of companies actually choosing to leave China and invest in manufacturing in other areas in Southern Asia or in Latin America. All of this with tensions in Taiwan put China in a pretty challenging position. Not only could there be an immediate security challenge with the United States, especially over Taiwan, there could be growing domestic instability. And that's where those corporate militias come in. They not only help the government and the military transition the economy faster into a wartime footing if needed, they also extend the reach of the central government and its influence into normal everyday civilian life. However, having said all of this, a growing middle class with more opportunity and more young people, they're increasingly rejecting Maoist ideology. In fact, this isn't even new either. Following Mao's death and the rise of Deng Xiaoping and his opening of China to the world, things like corporate militias went away. It'll be interesting to see whether these are maintained and what impact these have socially on China, and whether they're able to actually help China to maintain some sort of central control over the people, or if they lead to other kinds of discontent. In either case, I thought that this was interesting to see. Not in the, gee, I wish that we had those kind of way, but I just thought it was interesting that they're kind of doing that. Comment your thoughts on any of these stories, because we did talk about a lot, and I will see you all next time. Later.